Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Rockies Daily. I'm your host, Scott Ayers, where we talk all things Colorado Rockies. Let's just jump into it today, and let's talk about the buzz that we've seen online about owners fuming about the Kyle Tucker contract. Some are also upset about the Bo Bichette contract and how the Mets were able to acquire Bichette. But obviously, all the focus really is on the LA Dodgers being able to get Kyle Tucker for a contract that is the second largest valued contract, only behind the Shohei Ohtani contract, which isn't even really hitting the Dodgers' books right now because that money is all being deferred. And so, what does this all mean? The frustration, some of the buildup, that the owners will be pushing for a salary cap. And why does this matter is that the labor agreement ends in December of this year. So December 1st, the labor agreement ends, and a new one needs to be made and agreed upon. And if that doesn't happen, we will have a lockout. This is going to probably be one of the looming storylines here over the course of this season. And it's easy to understand why, just because of what we're seeing from some of these payrolls. Some of the owners feel like they just don't have a chance. Others see some of the owners with no salary floor, see some of the owners as maybe cheap. And so it's a really, really interesting situation right now, just in the state of baseball, with no salary cap and no salary floor. I do think that there needs to be both. There needs to be a way to kind of rein in and make sure that there isn't this massive competitive advantage for those that have the ability to spend what they're spending. But there also needs to be accountability for the owners that just refuse to spend and are really cheap and get away with being really cheap because it just means they're making more money because they don't have to spend anything. So you kind of go back and forth of you can see there's a lot of different perspectives. There's a lot of opinions. But one thing we know is that it feels like the owners are on one side and the players are over here. And that's not a good thing. The players believe that they need to get paid what they're owed. A salary cap kind of nixes some of that, right? Maybe not for the top end talent, but for anyone that's kind of just a tier or two below, their contracts are going to look different, and roster building will be entirely different. But my opinion on all this is that there needs to be some sort of cap. There needs to be both a cap and a floor. Just because you look at all other American sports and there is that salary cap there. So that way teams can't just spend whatever the heck they want. It's interesting. It's a very interesting time for Major League Baseball, and it's an important time because you also want to be able to attract new fans. And if fans don't think that there is certain levels of parity, it can be really easy to drive them away. And so that's why we're kind of hitting this juncture where the LA Dodgers, they've just won 2 World Series. And we mentioned on a show a couple days ago, but if when you typically win a championship in American sports, typically you're losing a couple guys to free agency because, all right, we can't afford everyone. Yeah, football's an example of like, all right, well, now we've got to pay, our quarterback, or we've got to pay this guy, or we've got to pay that guy. And obviously roster construction is different, roster sizes is different. But the concept remains the same, that typically you have some guys on really good contracts when you make a World Series run. And then after that's done, it's like, now we've got to fork over some money and pay them or lose some of them. And you just haven't seen that with the Dodgers. Instead, they have reloaded and not just signed measly contracts. I mean, they are spending so much money. So it's a very touchy time, and we're still essentially a year away, 11 months away from that labor agreement. But you hope that there's dialogue throughout this process so that when we get to December, there can come to some form of agreement, or I think the lockout will be pretty nasty. So we'll just have to wait and see. It's going to be one of the underlying stories of 2026, and I'm very, very curious to see how it all goes down. But let's now talk about free agency. Talk about the Rockies' free agency so far. They have signed major league contracts. Michael Lorenzen, Willie Castro. They trade for Jake McCarthy, who has an opportunity to be an everyday starter. They also sign Keegan Thompson, Brennan Bernardino, Troy Johnson, Nicky Lopez, and John Brebbia. Now, there's a good chunk of minor league contracts that the Rockies have signed these guys to. And guys that they've lost, Kyle Farmer, Jacob Stallings, Thairo Estrada, Herman Marquez, Austin Gomber, and Orlando Arcia. So overall, you look at both who they've added, who they've lost, and we mentioned in the last show, but this has been a really positive offseason for the Rockies. You look at the names that they've lost, and really the only one that I think hurts the soul is Herman Marquez, and that's just because of how long he'd been with the Rockies, the success that he'd had with the Rockies. But obviously he hasn't been the same pitcher. He's coming back from injuries that really kind of derailed what was a really promising player in Colorado. So Herman's really the only subtraction that hurts, and then you think of the guys that they've added. And I'm interested to see what some of these minor league contracts can do, right? You look at Thompson, who maybe that's a reliever that can be called up and make an impact. I think that the Rockies still probably want to sign another reliever, whether that's a minor or a major league guy, just to see what that can hold. Nicky Lopez is interesting. I am not the biggest Nicky Lopez fan, but it could be another Moniak situation where maybe this is a place where he can bounce back. The problem is his struggles are far worse than what we saw from Mickey Moniak when he was with the Angels. Lopez is a lot worse, and so you kind of look at some of these different signings. John Brebbia is interesting because it's like he might just be hurling meatballs, but there could be something there. And then, of course, the two major league signings, which I think were great, with Michael Lorenzen, who we've talked about, who wants to take on the challenge of pitching at Coors Field, which only really a madman would want, but he wants that. And then, of course, Willie Castro, who's going to be just a really good utility infielder for the Rockies. His bat is probably going to be the biggest question mark, is if we can get any productivity at the plate. But to sign a veteran and to get them on pretty friendly deals was substantial. So overall, if this is who the Rockies sign overall, and you in the offseason tomorrow, you walk away feeling okay, just because there are some building blocks. But, excuse me, it got me thinking, is obviously this offseason, the Rockies aren't going to make any big signings. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But if they can build and they can find some quality pieces within the organization for who they want to build around, next offseason could be really interesting. It could be interesting of who they want to target. They still might be a year away from really making any big signings through free agency. Big signings being guys, right, that are going to be on long-term deals that you're going to be forking over a good chunk of money for. But it's not crazy at all to at least start thinking and start considering, especially if 2026 shows you the building blocks that you hope they do. How nice would it be if the Rockies went after a guy who could be an ace for the team, who is his contract is going to be up at the end of this year, And you know what? You fork over enough money, and maybe he's the ace for the next 4 or 5 seasons for the Colorado Rockies. And that is, of course, of Freddie Peralta of the Milwaukee Brewers, who um, there have been a lot of rumors and speculation. Teams interested in trading for Peralta. Will the Brewers hold him for this upcoming season? Will they trade him? They could always look to re-signing him, but there is a real possibility that he's a free agent at the end of this upcoming season. And what does that look like for Colorado? It looks like that, it could be something where they pursue an ace. And I think that will be something that the Rockies need to do when they really build out this team and want to actually compete, is they are going to have to attract some type of starting pitching that can make a significant impact for them. Peralta's obviously one of those guys that is just such a good pitcher and would be so good for the Colorado Rockies. Do I think that it's a real world possibility? Probably not. It's probably slim margins, but it does have to be in the camp for the Rockies in terms of, hey, we can only grow so much internally. It is worth looking externally for a pitcher that can make a big impact. Now, obviously, when it comes to spending and it comes to how the Rockies spend, they just don't really spend that much on starting pitching through free agency. A lot of it has always been done just through the farm system. But if you want to compete at a high level, you have to have some of these top pitching prospects. And so for the Rockies, it is at least something to consider next offseason, right? It does not make sense to fork over, a bunch of trade assets, and they probably don't even have enough trade assets to make a move on someone like Peralta, right? He's just that good, and the Rockies just are that bad. But that will be the goal in the 26-27 offseason, the 27-28 offseason, is some of these guys whose contracts expired, how do you attract them to Coors Field? How do you get them to become Rockies? And how do you actually just build this thing out? So that's going to be a really big thing for Colorado moving forward. Peralta's obviously just one example, but it's going to be all the different things that they need to consider. And maybe they do build this all internally, and this team just has a farm system that flourishes. But just from what we've seen from the ranks that the Rockies get, their farm system just isn't great right now. And so it's hard to believe that some of the guys that they have currently that they can call up will make a huge impact long term. But you just never know. And it doesn't really necessarily matter what a farm system grade is. Guys can still be great without having the proper grade. But just means it's probably a little bit more difficult or harder to believe. But that's just an idea for someone going after someone like Peralta. We're obviously in the middle of the offseason where one can dream, and one's dreaming of having just a star starting pitcher here at Coors Field. And then finally, let's talk about the Hall of Fame. Carlos Beltran and Andrew Jones both admitted to the MLB Hall of Fame. Beltran, 82% of the votes. Andrew Jones got 78% to get in. You need at least 75% of the votes. The MLB Hall of Fame, probably the hardest to get into of all the major American sports. Basketball feels like they let just about anyone in. The NFL feels a little more rigorous. And truth be told, my knowledge of the NHL Hall of Fame isn't great in general. But MLB Hall of Fame, very difficult to get into. You also have some of the corniest people who are voting on this award, to get into the Hall of Fame. One of their new shticks is just leaving ballots blank. So if the writers think no one deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, hey, we're going to leave that blank and send it in. Which feels dumb to me. I think both of these guys are worthy of making it into the Hall, but it was the most blank ballots for a Hall of Fame vote since 2011. It's really writers just standing their ground. But if you do want to get a good kick out of just things in life, if life has you down, just look up at how some of these how corny some of these writers are, because it is ridiculous. Or some of the people that they vote for. And you're just like, how? How do you have access to essentially like the most powerful tool for a writer for baseball? And that is getting these guys into Hall of Fame, which is like ultimate legacy type of thing. And so, yeah, some of these writers are just, they're just dorks, man. They're just dorks. We're all dorks, though, I guess. So who am I to say? But it's just goofy. For the Rockies, we've obviously got two guys in the Hall of Fame. And it was very curious to think about who would be next in terms of players that are, played for the Rockies or are with the Rockies to make the Hall of Fame. Nolan Arenado is probably the best bet you have. And then outside of him, I don't know. I don't know which current Rockies player you look at and say, that guy has a good chance of making it into the Hall of Fame. Not many options at the moment. But again, that just shows how hard it is to get in the Hall of Fame. Also shows the Rockies haven't had any elite talent come to town for quite some time. But that's besides the point. Congratulations to those two guys for making it into the Hall of Fame. Something that I will never do in anything in my life. So congrats to them. Congrats. But that does it for another Rockies Daily. I'm Scott Ayers. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you tomorrow.